Good morning, everyone, or maybe good afternoon or good evening for some of you. I'm Jeff Fredericks, Regional Manager of Brokerage Operations for Avison Young, Northern California, and it's my pleasure to act as your Master of Ceremonies today for Insights 2023 Uncharted Waters. I earned my broker's license in college. I was 22 years old. I've been in commercial real estate now for more than 40 years. I've seen several downturns. I've seen 20% interest rates, the mortgage meltdown, the dot-com boom, and the dot-com plunge. But what we're witnessing today are uncharted waters. We've never seen anything like it. The market dynamics in those other times produced some big changes, but things eventually got back to some semblance of normal. Whereas some of the things we're witnessing today actually feel revolutionary. Maybe that's just because we're right in the middle of it. I don't know. But that's why Uncharted Waters is our theme for Insights 2023. These are uncharted waters and uncharted times for owners, occupiers, and commercial real estate consultants. All right, I'm going to get right to our speakers so we can keep today's program moving along quickly and finish in a little over an hour. That'll leave us a few minutes for Q&A. And I invite you to send us your questions using the Q&A button, which most of you should be able to find at the bottom of your screen. Your questions can be for our keynote speaker, Greg Valliere, or for any of our speakers today. All of the Q&A will be held at the end of the program so that we finish on time at 15 minutes past the hour. So here's what the next hour is going to look like. First up will be our NorCal Market Minute. Understanding that we have folks with us today from all across the country, we'll keep our market forecast brief and follow up by emailing all of you our Avison Young Regional Market Overview. But we do want to touch on just a few market highlights and share our Northern California commercial real estate outlook for 2023. And joining us for that discussion will be my boss and Avison Young Managing Director for Northern California, Nick Slonik. Along with providing his own welcome for all of you today, Nick will be serving as our San Francisco market expert during this morning's Market Minute. Amber Merrigan, Vice President, Office Leasing and Tenant Representation, joins from Oakland, and Amber will lend her expertise to the regional outlook for the East Bay region. And leading today's Q&A for the NorCal Market Minute and serving as our Silicon Valley expert will be Dina Gavea, Avison Young's Northern California Regional Lead for Innovation and Insight. For more than 2 decades, Dina has partnered with real estate teams and clients to create economic analysis, market studies, and white papers to help landlords, tenants, and investors make informed real estate decisions. Following today's NorCal Market Minute, we're going to hear from Avison Young Principal and Chief Economist Nick Axford. Nick will share his thoughts on the year ahead and some key issues that will impact real estate occupiers and investors, no matter where you're tuned in from today. And finally, our keynote speaker, Greg Valliere, Chief U.S. Policy Strategist for AGF Investments, will spend about 25 minutes with a rare insider look at what the Federal Reserve and Congress will do to keep the economy afloat in 2023 and the inevitable roadblocks that can be expected with the bitter divide that we're witnessing between the left and right. Greg will address that political divide, as well as the budget fight, tax reform, interest rates, geopolitics, and perhaps provide an early handicap of the 2024 elections. Okay, let's get started by turning the program over first to Nick Slonik, Principal and Regional Managing Director for Avison Young, Northern California. I think we can all agree that the commercial real estate industry has been navigating in uncharted waters since the pandemic began. But toss in a possible recession, and there's no doubt that we're caught in some turbulent market crosswinds. After Nick's welcome, he'll turn it over to Dina Gavea, who will help us navigate those crosswinds with her NorCal Market Minute. Okay, Nick, it's all yours.
Thank you, Jeff. Good morning. Thank you all for joining us today. Looks like we have over 400 folks RSVP'd, which could be an all-time record. Truly incredible. Look forward to an in-person event next year, which is always much more fun and productive. As most of you know, Avison Young has truly made an impact on the Bay Area real estate market, growing from 6 brave people in a San Francisco basement 11 years ago to 150 valued employees in 5 regional offices today. Further good news is that we are still growing locally and as a firm. Our 2022 acquisitions of Studio Eagle, a full-service project construction management firm, and Madison Marquette, a 20 million square foot property management portfolio, shows that we are committed to service all of our clients' needs. We have also added focused resources locally. These resources include our regional Avant data analytics team, a data center specialty group, an ESG governance expert, and top talent workplace, labor, and tax incentive consulting team. These resources, along with our focus on diversity, equity, and inclusion for the betterment of our private partnership, are an attractive platform for clients and talent wanting a different and holistic approach. All super exciting. Time to get on with the program and see if we can make sense of, or at least clarify, our industry's tumultuous headwinds and perhaps shed some light on our current US political landscape. No pressure, Nick, Greg. Dina, please take it away.
Thank you, Nick. I'm going to share my screen, and good morning, everyone. During this NorCal Minute, I wanted to share a few things about Avison Young's proprietary program, Avant, that helped us get some clarity on the topics we're going to be discussing today. Avant actually allows our team to help clients make location-based decisions in a more transparent and efficient manner. With more than 100 data partners covering 87 markets across 5 countries, through Avant, we can deliver products by intersecting data, analytics, and visualization to help our clients make informed decisions. So let's dive in. As most of you know, this is what we are hearing every single day.
Pre-COVID, Market Street would be buzzing with tech and office workers getting off of work at this hour. But this is how it looks now. Not very busy. But some wonder.
Many who are
Going back to the office is significantly lagging behind. So your data shows commercial real estate vacancies in San Francisco are at all-time high. Office utilization, and it has had the lowest office utilization since the very beginning. Right now, the national.
So how do we make sense of this noise? With so many headlines surrounding the commercial real estate sector, during this NorCal Market Minute, we plan to address some of these common concerns and our responses to the ongoing issues, primarily within the office market. Let's take a look at where we ended 2022 statistically. We saw a vacancy peak in our CBDs, and while asking rents have only softened, in some cases, more concessions are being offered more than ever before, driving net effective rents down by almost 15%. However, there are some bright spots in our return to office based on our mobility data. And after this meeting, we'll be providing a follow-up email with material that will include insights that we talk about today. Nick and Amber, let's talk about some of the drivers that are going to get us out of this mess and how long do you think it will take? Nick, let's start with you in San Francisco. With record vacancy hitting the market, when do you see it tapering off?
Well, over the past few decades, vacancy has increased after recessionary periods, with the most recent downturn showing the largest gap in Class A versus Class B. This suggests a significant move to flight to quality. More than 46% of the San Francisco tenant activity over the last 5 years was tech. If we looked at the San Francisco leasing market following the dot-com and financial crisis, the tenant mix was primarily FIRE, advertising, and law. This is occurring again. Historically, recovery has been rather short, say 18 months or so. It'll be a little longer this time. There's certainly some shadow space yet to hit the market, but tapering has started. A good example of shadow space to hit the market recently was that of Instagram's 400 square foot whole building sublease at 181 Fremont. It was available to tour last year, but didn't formally hit the market until 2 weeks ago. Again, the market is tapering as we speak, but we do have almost 27 million square feet, of which 8 million square feet is sublease space to absorb.
Thank you. What we've been seeing in Silicon Valley over the past decade is tech tenants taking a large amounts of space ahead of actually needing it, which contributes to the dramatic shedding of space during downturns. Our figures are showing that the .com bust vacancy for Silicon Valley was 5% higher than in San Francisco and never fully recovered before the next downturn hit, the financial crisis, a few years later. Over the past decade, we saw a large expansion of the tech hub and spoke models with increased tech occupancy in San Francisco. And now post-pandemic, it's almost if the roles are reversed, where Silicon Valley is approximately 6% lower than San Francisco and Oakland CBDs for year-end 2022, and seemingly may be the first to recover based on return to office. So Nick, are you seeing a flight to quality, and what will landlords need to do in 2023 to entice tenants?
100%. A flight to quality, experience, and location. Quality is obvious, trophy or better, but less space. Experience, it's all about the amenities. And location. For San Francisco, the CBD is the belle of the ball. As a result, trophy net effective rents have proven to be more stable than Class A net effective rents, demonstrating the imbalance between the two sectors due to tenant mix and demand. Class A rents are down almost 13% from their peak from Q2 2020 to year-end 2022. Enticement, landlords will have to invest some serious CapEx for amenities experience. A great example is the new bar Spestura at One Maritime Plaza, the old Punchline. Concessions, which include enhanced free rent and tenant improvement allowances, unsolicited proposals, landlords need to be proactive. They need to there are several examples in the market where landlords are offering on an unsolicited basis 24 months of free rent over a 12-year term with $250 dollars per square foot for tenant improvement allowance. Unfortunately, this is where we are today.
Thank you. So Amber, switching gears, what are some of the strategies landlords in Oakland are doing to differentiate themselves and stabilize their portfolios?
Yeah, thanks, Dina. With vacancy rates hovering just below 30% in downtown Oakland CBD, a few things that will be on trend with office leasing in 2023 are spec suites. Landlords need to be willing to proactively improve and deliver spaces in move-in ready or spec condition. Since the pandemic, the bulk of my clients have only been interested in leasing spaces that require little to no construction. This feedback is consistent amongst tenants that we're seeing on our landlord listings. And spec suites make up the majority of leased space post-pandemic. Improved spaces in move-in ready condition are going to lease, while spaces that are requiring construction are going to sit for some time. Another trend, relationships will be more important than ever. In a market where you have 20 to 40 options in any given requirement size, brokers filter their property options based on their relationships, selecting brokers that they trust and landlords who have a reputation of being easy to work with. In today's market, it's critical to have a dynamic listing team with exceptional broker relationships and for landlords to be perceived as straightforward deal makers. Lastly, landlords will continue to implement creative concession packages, as Nick mentioned, to help bridge the gap between maintaining healthy face rents and meeting tenant expectations. I think that in 2023, we're going to continue to see those large concessions, but we're also going to see concessions stretch beyond that. Likely into making move-in more effortless for tenants. To give you guys an example, I've seen several landlords who are willing to help with furniture procurement, provide moving allowances, and even offer up parking abatement just to help alleviate those added costs associated with returning to work.
Thanks, Amber. So let's address the biggest question out there, Nick. Can you address the concerns regarding the return to office for San Francisco? And do you think remote hybrid work is here to stay? Unmute.
After 2 years, you figure that one out. Thanks, Dina. Despite layoffs in the tech industry, the local job market remains healthy. San Francisco and San Mateo counties added 4,400 jobs in December. The tech-rich information sector did lose jobs on a net basis, but this was more made up by job growth in professional and technical services, healthcare, and retail trade. As of December of 22, San Francisco and Oakland CBDs saw 45% and Oakland 41% office visitation. This is up by more than 10% over 2021 for both markets. Despite the buzz regarding remote work, only 1 of 5 San Francisco job postings are remote, which also includes hybrid. Over the past year, the proportionate share of remote to non-remote has largely plateaued, which bodes well for occupancy levels. The city's unemployment rate fell to 2%, a near record low, although the labor force is still 20,000 smaller than at the start of the pandemic. Remote hybrid is here to stay for some, but certainly not all.
Thanks, Nick. For Silicon Valley, it actually reported the highest percentage of office site visits based on mobility data at 61.8%, witnessed since the onset of the pandemic. This is very good news, and we suspect this is due to a higher percentage of workers returning to the office following mass layoffs announcements in Q3 2022, as well as a larger share of workers living in the area relative to their workplace. So we only have a few minutes left. Amber, back to you. Describe the landscape of Oakland. We know that San Francisco is fairly tech heavy. How dependent is Oakland on the San Francisco overflow?
Yeah, that's a great question. So generally, Oakland is less volatile since our tenant makeup is mostly professional service industries such as law firms, engineering, healthcare, biotech, and nonprofit organizations. And Oakland's diversified tenant composition is better positioned to weather a recession relative to tech-centric compositions of San Francisco and Silicon Valley. With that being said, Oakland is still very much feeling the pain from the lack of tech demand. Since if you recall, this is really what caused the floodgates to open during the boom of 2015 to 2019 in Oakland. The lack of tech demand and recent subleases attribute to a decline in occupancy. We've also seen less tenant migration coming from San Francisco as inexpensive options surface in San Francisco and Oakland's hold on to pre-pandemic rents. This may be something Oakland landlords look to reconsider in 2023.
Great. So what is the advantage for Oakland long-term?
I mean, long-term, you can't beat location. Oakland will continue to serve as the closest central business district in proximity to the Bay Area's workforce. Its central location to BART, freeways, diverse culture, temperate weather, make it a no-brainer that Oakland will be back, but I think patience will be a prerequisite.
Wonderful. Okay, let's do some rapid fire predictions in closing. Where do we go from here? And if you could both unmute and keep it to one-word answers. Nick, will start with you and then Amber following. 2023 asking rents, up or down, and by how much?
Level.
All right, down 15%.
What industries will expand, Nick?
Robotics and artificial intelligence.
Professional services.
More folks in the office?
Absolutely.
Yes.
Capital markets in trouble?
Big time.
Total turmoil.
Product type most likely to recover first after industrial?
Retail.
Class A spec suites.
Bay Area market to recover first?
Silicon Valley.
Oakland.
When are we back to normal?
Q3 24.
Q4 24.
Okay, Super Bowl or Phoenix Open?
Both.
Super Bowl, but I'm there for Rihanna.
Great. Okay, guys, any final thoughts, Nick?
Yes, the Bay Area is this very special place. Cal, Berkeley, Stanford, UCSF, Santa Clara, et cetera, are not going anywhere. They are an international attractor for top talent educators and young, vibrant intellectual capital. Sand Hill Road and the VC community are not going anywhere. Tahoe, Napa, Carmel, Stinson Beach, Half Moon Bay are not going anywhere. The global attraction to the Bay Area will continue to thrive despite the downward pressure of all the background noise, which thankfully means growth and prosperity. When? Sooner than one might think. Wishing you all a very safe, healthy, and prosperous 2023. Thank you.
Great. Amber?
Yeah, I think ample inventory will create a continued competitive landscape for landlords, but we can definitely look forward to and anticipate that leasing and return to office numbers will dramatically improve in 2023.
Thank you. Thanks, Nick and Amber. Jeff, turning it back to you.
Thank you, Dina. Thanks for leading that Q&A. Thank you, Amber. Thank you, Nick, for your participation. And those tuned in today, stay tuned for our NorCal market report, which you'll receive subsequent to this event. If you have questions about the NorCal commercial real estate outlook that you can't wait on, please post them using the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. Okay, let's broaden our focus now. Next up is Nick Axford, Principal and Chief Economist for Avis & Young. Nick has over 30 years experience in real estate research and consulting in the private sector, having led teams in the UK, European, Asia Pacific, and global levels. Based in London, Nick is responsible for Avis & Young's global market analysis and thought leadership activities. This morning, Nick will provide our thoughts on the year ahead and the market trends that will help shape investment and occupancy strategies in 2023. Welcome, Nick Axford.
Great, thank you. Thank you very much indeed, Jeff, and good morning, everybody from here in London. I'm going to do a quick run through the publication that we've just launched, 10 Trends for 2023, came out earlier this week, focusing on a few things, some mainstream, some less so, that we think are going to influence the real estate market in 2023 and quite probably beyond. So let's just do a quick run through. I haven't got time to go into all 10 in detail. So let's have a quick run through. And I'm going to start with number 2. We'll leave number 1 because I'm going to come back to that. So number 2 is operational excellence. And as you've heard, that's about the real increased focus on management and operationally really understanding what's going on inside buildings, including in mainstream sectors, the office sector, following retail down the path of the drive for experience, but also how investors are increasingly targeted other more niche sectors where really understanding what's going on under the hood of the building from an occupier point of view is really, really important. That links to our third trend, which we call doctor's orders, which digs in a bit more detail along those lines to look at the opportunities in the healthcare sector, where demand has increased quite significantly due to a variety of societal trends, but particularly accelerated by the pandemic, and where we're using advanced data analytics to really help operators and investors understand what's going on in the sector and where the opportunities might lie. Trend 4, deglobalization 3.0. It's a topic that we've covered several times in the past. And this time what we're really focusing on is how the ongoing changes in locations of production and supply chains are still being influenced by the trend towards deglobalization, and particularly the rise of the conflict in Ukraine, giving an accelerated emphasis on what's becoming termed friendshoring, which is actually still continuing to reshape the landscape for production and logistics. Changing focus, trend number 5, picks up on a core ESG theme, the environment and sustainability. And we call it critical mass because it's looking at the growth of mass timber actually as a structural component for the construction of commercial real estate buildings. It's becoming more prominent. The buildings that it's being used in are getting taller. And we see this as a trend that in many markets is going to become more prominent over the years and an aspect that people ought to start getting familiar with. Similarly, within the ESG space and the environment, trend 6, new lease of life. This focuses on the trend that we see for green leases and green lease clauses, which have been around for quite a while, to become more prominent in leases going forward. That's because both market pressures, but particularly regulations, are requiring an increased emphasis on data and understanding the environmental performance of buildings and disclosure of those buildings. That's putting obligations on both landlords and occupiers, and those are going to need to be incorporated into lease agreements to make clear who needs to do what, when, and why. Trend number 7, cities revitalized, picks up on a theme that we've already heard a bit about in terms of the way in which cities are coming back to life, but they're not coming back the same as they were. And as Dina was talking about, we talk about how our Avant analytics platform and particularly our Vitality Index helps understand the patterns that we see as different cities start to recover. And particularly, we dig into the issue that was referred to about flight to quality and the fact that we see a big bifurcation in the office market coming, with better quality, better located space performing very differently to some of the more secondary space that could suffer quite significantly. Returning to the ESG theme with trend number 8, maximum impact, we pick up on some of the challenges that are certainly being faced by our inner city areas and urban areas, which really require investment and regeneration. And we see a coming together of the private sector and the public sector in partnership, with the private sector with an increasing focus on social value in the developments and investments that they're undertaking. And that can be a big stimulus and catalyst to helping revitalise impact investing and the regeneration of many of our cities. Slightly linked to that, trend number 9, cost of living, focuses on the opportunity in the affordable housing sector. In many countries around the world, we have what amounts to a housing crisis, particularly at the affordable level. And although it can be challenging to make that financially viable, we see an increasing range of incentives coming available that will help bridge the gap. And we particularly think it's worth looking into a sector where the underlying demand drivers are strong, because there is almost limitless demand for this space. And trend number 10, we take a look at the metaverse, which hasn't probably had the best of presses in recent months, but we think that focusing on some of the challenges of Bitcoin or whether people are really going to live out their lives in Decentraland actually misses some of the really important ways that the technology that underpins Web 3.0 and the metaverse is actually already having an impact on the real estate market. So that's 9 of the trends. The 10th one, we've called higher for longer, and I'm going to spend a few minutes just digging into that, because I think it hits to the turmoil that was referred to in the capital markets. Because as I'm sure you're aware, the key issue that we've been facing in recent years is that after 40 years of low inflation since the hyperinflation of the 70s, we've seen an extended period of low and relatively stable inflation, which has obviously not been the case over the last couple of years, that we've seen inflation spiking very rapidly, not just in North America and in the US, but really right the way around, certainly the Western world. To an extent that was completely unprecedented, the speed with which inflation has picked up. Now, the good news is that in most places, we think that inflation has turned the corner. Certainly here in the US, we've now seen several months of weakening, not just headline inflation, but core inflation starting to decline as well. And we do think that we're now sort of at the turning point. We are going to see inflation trending downwards from here on in, although it won't necessarily be a uniformly smooth, plain sailing process. But of course, it's going to happen in a context against which we've seen central banks in their desperation to tackle inflation and prevent a wage price spiral. We've seen central banks around the world hiking policy rates very, very dramatically and very aggressively, on almost certainly the fastest rate that we've seen since the 1970s and 1980s. We're not at the peak yet, but as the announcements and comments that have been made by the Fed yesterday, the Bank of Canada last week, and the Bank of England today, we are now starting to see, we think, light at the end of the tunnel, and we're getting close to the peak. We're not quite there yet, but we're getting quite close to the peak. I think the key message that I want to get across, and I'm sure Greg will have some comments on this as well, is that whilst inflation might be turning the corner, and whilst there may well be discussion about whether or not the Fed's going to start plateauing for most of this year, and then could even be cutting rates by the end of the year, personally, I think inflation could stay a bit stickier than people think, and that we might be lucky to see any cuts by the end of the year. I'm not sure necessarily when we get a 25 or 50 basis point reduction is the point. The point is far more that we believe that we are very unlikely to go back to anything like the sort of level of interest rates that we saw in not just the pandemic period, but in most of the post-financial crisis period. And that's really important for the financial markets, and it's really important for real estate, because the corollary of that low level of stable inflation over the last 30 or 40 years has been this long-run downward trend in not just policy rates, but in market interest rates, in the 10-year government bond yields around the world. This has been a huge following wind for real estate and lots of other investment markets, as this is the benchmark against which pretty much every other kind of investment asset is priced. And what's really interesting is, to look at, it's the speed of the correction that is catching everybody out, and the very, very low level of interest rates and benchmark yields that we're coming from. It's perfectly possible. We're not going in, we're not in some unusual blip period which is going to correct very quickly. We're actually, we believe, going back to a much more normal interest rate environment. And that means that the type of correction that we're seeing in pricing, we need to think of as actually a return to something more normal rather than a blip that's going to automatically correct. Now, real estate doesn't directly follow what goes on in the 10-year government bond yield market. An interesting comparison is with the 10-year BBB corporate bond market, which builds in the risk of tenant default. And here you can see the close relationship between real estate yields, real estate cap rates, and the 10-year BBB, excuse me, which is even stronger if we allow for the time lag that feeds through in the market. It takes time for real estate to respond. You can see there's a very strong correlation there. So if we're thinking about what real estate pricing looks like, you can see that the real estate cap rate is effectively made up of three components. There's that risk-free rate, the 10-year government bond, the risk of corporate credit default, which is the BBB spread, and then the orange bit is the bit that's directly attributed to real estate. Now, this is annual data and there are leads and lags, but we can see some interesting patterns if we just take some summaries from the pre and post GFC period, stripping out the periods of real turmoil. You can see that in the run up to the financial crisis, real estate was based off somewhere around 500 basis points of risk-free, 200 basis points of corporate risk, and then 75 basis points or so of real estate. In the period up to the pandemic, the big difference was the fact that those risk-free rates, those 10-year government bond yields, were significantly lower. And so we can use these relationships and the fact that there is typically around a 12-month lag between what goes on in those financial markets and what goes on in real estate to sort of project forward what the financial markets are currently telling us and giving us a sort of direction of travel for what's going to happen in real estate. Now, the yield data here is still a little bit dated. We're still waiting for data to come through for the latter part of the year. But what you can see is that quite clearly that the whole pricing environment for real estate has changed very, very dramatically. And I'll come back and look at where that might be going in a second. But the other thing that's really interesting is that real estate pricing isn't just related to the BBB. It's quite interesting if we look at those BBB corporate bond yields and the relationship with investment transaction volumes. This is average rolling 6-month transaction volumes. You can see there's a very strong negative correlation, so that when those bond yields go up very sharply, repricing tends to happen. The first thing that happens is the market stops. People wait and see what's going to happen. The bid-ask spread widens. And therefore, you can see very clearly how the immediate impact of that increasing bond yield and change in pricing has been a dramatic decline in the volume of transactions that we're seeing in the market, albeit that, you know, the level of transactions, even though it might feel a lot slower than it was, you know, is still actually at what historically has been quite a high level. And if we just dig into the sectors, here what we do is look at the volumes in each of the sectors. And what we've done is compared them to the average that we saw during the period from 2015 to 19, pre-pandemic, which was actually relatively stable in terms of the volume of activity. And what we've also done is just seasonally adjust it. So at any point, what you're comparing is the transactions in the last 3 months compared with the equivalent average 3 months during 2015 to 19. So it takes account of the seasonality of the market. What you can see is that in 2021 and 2022, we had a really active market as we came out of the pandemic, but that has really slowed very, very dramatically over the course of recent years. I mean, in the apartment and industrial markets, the transactions we've seen still pretty much in line with what we were seeing in 2015 to 19, but falling off in the retail and office market. And just digging into the office market in a little bit more detail, also interesting that there are some nuances there. You know, this is on the same basis. What you can see is that there was a recovery in office transactions across the US to above the 2015 and 19 averages. during the up to the early part of 2022. But since then, there's been a decline. And particularly, even though suburban office transactions are now 40% below what we would normally expect at this time of year, actually CBD office transactions are 80% below those averages, and in fact back down to the sort of levels that we were seeing at the height of the pandemic. So clearly we are at the point at the moment where there is still price discovery to happen in order to get the market moving again. To finish, where do we think we're going? Well, on the left, you've seen those two bars before. Where do things stand at the moment? Well, at the moment, the 10-year government bond is up at around 3.4%. The BBB spread around 200 basis points, roughly where we would expect it to be. Real estate hasn't yet corrected. If we look forward, we would expect, given that we don't expect interest rates to come back down very significantly over the next few years, we would expect the 10-year government bond to benchmark probably somewhere just north of 3%, which is significantly higher than we've been used to in recent years. The corporate spread, I don't think there's any particular reason to expect that to expand. But depending on where you are in the real estate market, I've put on a 50 basis point risk premium here for real estate. That could be a bit cautious, particularly in parts of the office market where I think people are seeing more risk associated with real estate now than there has been. So what that suggests is that if those benchmark quality real estate yields, cap rates are currently around 4.8%, it suggests that there is still a material way to move before we start seeing pricing coming back into line with where we think the equilibrium point is relative to other assets. So correction to come. The more we get pricing discovery, which hopefully will come as we start seeing potentially some distressed sales or liquidity coming back, investors seeing a bit more comfort around what they think the interest rate outlook looks like, being able to price deals again, starting to then put their plans in place. So hopefully a return to a more active transaction market as we come through the latter part of, potentially the latter part of the first half, but more likely into the second half of 2023. So there we go, a very quick canter through our 10 trends for 2023. With that, I will try.
Thank you, Nick. If you have questions about our top 10 trends for 2023 or any other questions for Nick, as well as for our next speaker, Greg Valliere, please go ahead and post those using the Q&A button. You can select that at the bottom of your screen. Okay, I'm excited to move on to our keynote speaker. With over 30 years of experience covering Washington for institutional investors, Greg Valliere provides an unmatched perspective on economic policy and politics and the impacts they have on markets and family finances. Greg is frequently quoted in the nation's financial press, and he's a regular contributor for CNBC, Bloomberg TV and Radio, Fox TV, CNN, and CBS Radio. Hearing Greg speak, I know, is an annual tradition for many of you. And for those of you who haven't heard Greg before, you're in for a real treat. Welcome, Greg Valliere.
Well, thank you very much, Jeff. I have really enjoyed this event over the years. I'm honored to be with such great presenters. I've enjoyed the information we've gotten over the last half an hour or so. So I have to scratch my head and ask myself, what should I talk about that maybe is a little different? And what I think I'll do is, for the first time in all the years I've done this talk for your groups, Jeff, I'm going to start with geopolitics. We'll certainly get into the Fed and Kevin McCarthy in Congress and the political climate, but I would argue that geopolitical uncertainty is still with us, and sadly maybe with us for quite some time, with three particular crises that I think, unfortunately, are not going to subside anytime soon. Well, let me start with the obvious one, and that, of course, is Ukraine. When the Russians invaded almost a year ago now, February 24th, I was very outspoken. I said that there is no way the Russians could win this war, and I still think there's no way the Russians can win this war, at least with any traditional definition of the word win. I can't see, after the debacle and humiliation for Vladimir Putin, I cannot see this wind up being a victory for the Russians, who have lost, according to a friend of mine at the Pentagon, they've lost about 125,000 of their troops, fatalities. The Ukrainians have lost maybe 75 or 80,000, also an appalling number. And of course, you see now in Russia, young Russian men fleeing Moscow, fleeing St. Petersburg, going to Istanbul, going to Helsinki. You see an exodus now in Russia. So this has been an extraordinary story, one of the most uplifting stories of my entire career, to see the Ukrainian army has this kind of courage and this willingness to defend their country. I've said in the last year over and over again, I think the big difference between the two countries is troop morale. I think Russian soldiers are not that interested in trying to do anything for Vladimir Putin. I think Ukrainian soldiers are willing to die for their country. That is a big, big difference between the two military forces. So what's going to happen? What is a likely scenario? I think that we will continue pretty much in this stalemate. There are a lot of reports in the last days that we could see a new offensive by the Russian troops, not out of the question. The tanks that the US and Germany have promised to Ukraine may not arrive for several more months, maybe even longer. So I cannot, unfortunately, forecast a big Ukrainian surge to bring this conflict to an end. Could Putin use extraordinary weapons of mass destruction, biological, chemical, even nuclear? Maybe, but I hear from my friends in the Pentagon that the Russian generals might not obey an order to use these weapons. The Russian generals, I'm told, despise Putin. At least a dozen Russian generals have been killed, fairly unusual. And I'm told that many of the Russian generals who have been killed by their own troops. So it's an environment where I don't think the Russian generals are going to agree to use poison gas or whatever that could affect their own troops if the wind blows this back toward Russian front lines. So I don't see that. I don't see any sign that the Russians are going to make huge advances back into the center of the country. I think they've realized that is futile. I could see the Ukrainians moving further to the east, pushing maybe even right up to the Russian border. That's not out of the question. But I would say the two most intriguing and likely scenarios are, number one, a possibility that someone might try to take out Putin. Not out of the question that young oligarchs and generals could try to take him out. It's hard to get to him. He has this big table that's about a mile long. You can't really get into his face. But I do think that there's a reason why Putin allegedly has a food taster, or several food tasters. They get the first bite before he does, just to make sure that the food is not tainted. Putin reportedly is paranoid about someone trying to do this to him. There have been rumors in the past year that Putin may have some sort of neurological disorder, but you can't count on that. I'm not sure that's right, but you do see in some of the media, New York Post in particular, constant reports that Putin could be in serious health condition. I kind of doubt that. The most likely scenario, I would say, would be a truce at some point, maybe in the spring, and the beginning of negotiations, maybe brokered by Erdogan of Turkey, maybe brokered by Macron of France. The problem, though, is that if we get to negotiations, there is one issue that to me is really almost intractable, and that is that both Zelensky and Putin view Crimea as a sacred part of their country. Neither leader wants to give up any of Crimea. That's going to be a tough one to bring this to a close. So I have to conclude that a stalemate is continued likelihood with trench warfare looking like 1917 or 1918, with neither side gaining huge amounts of land. Perhaps the spring and summer weather could change that outlook. But sadly, I think this gridlock will continue. And I think that means that we'll continue to have an impact on prices of goods. Thankfully for Western Europe, as Nick knows, the weather's been pretty temperate. Natural gas prices have not gone way up, largely because of the of weather. But again, I think we see this go on for quite some time, accompanied by two other very big geopolitical stories that I'll quickly mention. The next one, of course, would be U.S.-China relations. I think that they will stay extremely rocky. I always point out that here inside of the Beltway in Washington, both parties have a bipartisan antipathy toward China, a feeling that China doesn't treat its dissidents fairly. China has not been transparent on COVID. China steals our corporate secrets. China continues to threaten Taiwan and other areas of the South China Sea. And lo and behold, Kevin McCarthy, who I'll talk about in a minute or two, his first piece of legislation after he became Speaker of the House was a bill to create a special committee to look at all of these alleged Chinese offenses, which may lead to even more sanctions. And the bill got support of nearly 50% of all Democrats, as well as a majority of Republicans. So it showed to me that both parties are not happy with the Chinese, and that any kind of breakthrough on trade or any kind of diplomatic issue is quite unlikely. I don't think Joe Biden is inclined to come up with a deal for China, because there would be inevitable criticism that somehow ties his son Hunter Biden to any kind of a sweetheart deal with Beijing. The third big geopolitical crisis is obviously the Iranian Ayatollahs, who are willing to kill their own people because they don't like what these young people are wearing. It's an appalling story. The U.S. intelligence people that I talk to are convinced that the Iranians are within a few months of having a crude nuclear bomb. Delivery capability could take longer, but the prospect of an Iranian nuclear bomb has certainly motivated the Israelis, the arch enemy of Iran. The Israelis are now in a war, in my opinion, a drone war, where they're going after Iranian nuclear scientists, they're going after Iranian military installations, and I think that will continue. And I think the Iranians will continue to be very provocative in the Persian Gulf. So you have three really nerve-wracking stories that will keep the markets on edge, in my opinion: Ukraine, China, and Iran. I do think that the defense sector will continue to see big increases. In this current fiscal year, the Pentagon is enjoying a 10% increase in spending. U.S. defense spending is now about $850 billion a year. Now, in a very interesting angle is that some of the more conservative House members, those who are more conservative than Kevin McCarthy, are beginning to question why we're spending so much on defense and why we're spending so much on the Ukrainians. And I think you're starting to see a backlash. And it's possible that the defense sector, instead of getting 10%, maybe they'll get 5%. It still will be an increase, but it will be a reduced increase because of this new mood on spending. And really, this allows me now to make a transition to the big domestic story here, I think, for the rest of this year in Washington, and that is this new fiscal austerity that the Republicans will bring to the debate. And I think that will lead to the big fight of the year domestically, and that is the possibility that the U.S. could actually default on our debt. It's unthinkable. It's never happened before. When there have been charges that it might occur, people say it's like the little boy who cries wolf, and it always is avoided at the very last minute. This one will be a little bit more nerve-wracking. I think we could go right up until a few days before a default could occur. Why? because the new House members, I think, are not willing to raise the debt ceiling. They want to get real, meaningful spending cuts, and the way they think they can get it is to use the debt ceiling as a political club, a weapon that could at least threaten a default. I've been saying it's 60-40. I know Jeff sees my stuff, and I've been predicting 60-40 that we will not have a default. But 40 is a big number. I mean, there's a 40% chance we could have, at least briefly, a government default. I think the key wild card in this story, it makes me stay at 60-40, is Jerome Powell, the chairman of the Federal Reserve. I think Powell would be quite reluctant, but if he had to, I think he would have the Fed buy bonds that are about to default. Powell has stated that is a loathsome scenario. He doesn't want to do it, but I think if there is a real chance that we could default, I think the Federal Reserve may have to step in. So that's a wild card for the interest rate markets, for bond investors, if we see the Federal Reserve having to do something so unprecedented. So while we're on the Fed, a few comments on Jerome Powell and what he's been doing. I've been quite critical of him. I think that Powell was slow to react to inflation. He was naive. He was way too sanguine on the inflation threat. And now I think he's trying to make up for that failure by staying quite restrictive on monetary policy. I was a little surprised yesterday by his comments during the press conference, a little more dovish than I had expected. I still think we have another rate hike or two to go, 25 basis points, not, we're done with 75 or 50, but I think another move in March and maybe one more late spring, early summer may occur as the Fed really wants to be sure they've slain the inflation dragon. What puzzles me is a view in the markets that we could see the Fed cut rates. And as Nick said, I think that is a little premature. Possibly a year from today, maybe the Fed will be seriously considering a rate cut. But the idea that they could cut rates in the second half of this year, before Christmas of this year, to me is pretty far-fetched. I think they're not totally done with inflation for one major reason. And it's not inflation from goods like oil or grain or metals, things like that. It's inflation from labor. We still have a very tight labor market. When people say, oh, we could have a recession and the economy is weak, well, unemployment is at 3.5%. I don't think I've ever seen a recession with unemployment that low. And it'll drift higher. It will get to 4, maybe a little higher than that. But I do think the labor market in many areas is tight. I appreciate that there have been layoffs. I get that. But I think in a lot of other areas in the service sector, whether it's restaurants or carpenters or painters, there's an acute shortage of labor. And I would argue, some people don't like me saying this, but I would argue that an answer would be immigration reform. We need more workers in the U.S. We need more legal immigrants. And I think that would be one of the answers. Yet I don't see any hope whatsoever for reform passing in Congress. I think it's very, very unlikely. So to wrap up on Congress, this is a Congress that is in a new mood. I think that McCarthy has made a lot of compromises to get the job as House Speaker. I think you'll see the Republicans in a very volatile climate, as Jeff says, uncharted waters, I think, for the Republicans for quite some time with the House this tightly divided. Let me spend my last 4 or 5 minutes on my favorite subject, and that, of course, is politics. Two big stories. One is Donald Trump running again. But something different is happening, and that is many Republicans want to look at other candidates. The phrase I hear all the time in Washington is, maybe we should move on. Maybe we should look at someone else. And I would say, here in early February, that if the Republican primary was held in one day, if it was held tomorrow in every state, I do think Ron DeSantis of Florida, the governor, would win. I make him the favorite. I certainly appreciate that Donald Trump has a solid base of support, and you underestimate Trump at your own peril. But I think that DeSantis has an excellent chance. He's not real warm and cuddly, but he's popular in Florida, and he's a fresh face. And if there's a theme right across the board, it's that voters, I think, would like to see some fresh options. And DeSantis is in his mid-40s. So that would be quite a change from Donald Trump, who is 76. So I think the Republicans are going to have many candidates, not just DeSantis. Unquestionably, Nikki Haley is going to run. I think she'll announce in the next couple of weeks. Probably Mike Pompeo, the former Secretary of Defense and State. Probably Mike Pence. I'd keep everyone here until evening if I went through all of the candidates who are thinking of running, but I think it'll be a pretty big group. But at least for right now, I think DeSantis is the guy to watch. And if there's a wild card, it's a fellow by the name of Glenn Youngkin, the governor of Virginia, very conservative on social issues, won a stunning landslide, an upset a couple of years ago in Virginia. But most importantly, he's worth $500 million. So he can self-finance a campaign. So Glenn Youngkin is somebody I'd look at carefully. And then finally, what about Joe Biden? Well, like everyone in our industry, I do not like to be wrong. It makes me upset when I get something wrong. And I may have been wrong last year when I predicted that Joe Biden would not run for a second term. He sure is looking like he is going to run. My logic last year hasn't changed one iota. My logic was that if he won a second term, he would be leaving the White House at the age of 86. It's a stressful job. This job has really diminished people because of all of the pressure. I think most Americans would think that 86 is just a little bit too old. But Biden may run. If he does, he'll clear the field. I don't think there would be many Democrats who would want to take him on if he does seek re-election. I will tell you this, though. When all of the stories broke a couple of weeks ago about top secret documents that he had in his garage, I talked to a lot of Democrats in this town who, by the way, are surprisingly lukewarm toward Biden. And all of these people said, well, you know, if this document scandal grows, we might have to look at other candidates. And I think there are Democrats who really do want to see a fresh face. And again, I could be here for another 2 hours naming all the governors who might run, lots of other people like Pete Buttigieg and Amy Klobuchar, and we can't forget Kamala Harris. So I would say that there could be a huge field if Biden decides at the last minute that he is not going to run. Not sure about your governor, Newsom. I would acknowledge that he has the best hair in politics, but I'm not sure that Newsom would be a credible challenger. We'll have to see on that. So a lot going on. Needless to say, I think that the big story economically is going to be tighter monetary and fiscal policy. I fully agree that rates are not going to plunge. Rates are going to stay a little higher than we've seen in the last few years. And we're certainly going to see a change in fiscal policy. Just one set of figures before I stop. One of the reasons why Republicans are so upset about spending is that total U.S. debt is now $31.4 trillion that we have in debt. All estimates that I've seen show that we'll have deficits of more than $1 trillion a year for the rest of the decade. So there is going to be a real assault on deficits. So I think both monetary and fiscal policy will dampen economic growth. It doesn't mean we're going to have a recession, but I think growth will be a little slower than we've seen in the last few years. So why don't I stop there, Jeff? And I think we'll take some questions.
All right. Thank you very much, Greg. That was outstanding as usual. We do have a couple of questions here. I want to invite any other questions that folks might want to submit. And I will start with you, Greg. There's a question that asks you to speak a little bit on the extremes, the far left and the far right in DC, how that looks to you right now, in your seat?
It's very frustrating to see. I mean, there are so many issues that need to be addressed, but everything is polarized in this city. I think that McCarthy is on such a short leash. He agreed with the far right that to a provision that would allow one member of the House, one member, to initiate a process whereby the House Speaker, Kevin McCarthy, could be ousted. I mean, that certainly is an incentive for House Republicans to stay pretty assertive in their policies, but with the Democrats as well. There's on the left, you see a lot of friction as well. I would say one of the interesting stories in the last few years is the demise of the progressive movement. The progressives have failed, at least on a Washington standpoint, maybe not California, but the progressives have failed. We're not going to stack the Supreme Court. We're not going to make Washington, D.C. a state. We're not going to have a wealth tax. You'll hear a lot about a wealth tax in some states, but certainly not on the federal level. So you do see the progressives have not had much luck with their agenda, but they'll continue to talk about aggressive policies. And frankly, I can't think of too many politicians who would successfully run as moderates. You're either going to be well to the left or well to the right, unfortunately.
And so how do you think that's all going to shake out in the elections coming down the pike with respect to the balance of power between the Republicans and the Democrats?
I think it's going to stay remarkably close. I did a piece the other day looking at the Senate. There's a good chance the Senate goes back to the Republicans. It's just every 2 years, a third of the Senate is up, and it just so happens in the next Senate elections that a lot of Democrats look vulnerable. Several Democrats look vulnerable. The House will be razor thin. And I think whoever wins the White House will win narrowly. We're in this era of everything being razor tight. And again, unfortunately, I don't think there's going to be any change. There is one story that I think is encouraging, and that is a consensus that we're not going to have any big change on taxes. You may hear talk about a VAT tax, VAT tax. Not going to happen. You may hear stories about some changes for the very wealthy. Not going to happen. So one of the implications of McCarthy now running the House is that any kind of activist tax legislation from the Senate will die in the House. We're not going to see a change in capital gains. We're not going to see a change in the step-up basis or any of that stuff because, again, the House would reject it. So on that, I think we get a breather. I don't think we're going to have to worry about higher taxes until maybe 2 or 3 years from now when we have to begin debating what to do with the Trump tax cuts. But that's a story for 2 or 3 years away. For now, we get a break and don't see any big tax changes.
Great, thanks. I know that Nick Exford may be having a problem with his mic. Mike, do you want to give that a shot?
Yeah, is that okay? I think it's okay.
Yeah, it sounds great.
Cool.
So question for you on your trends. You definitely highlighted one, but what do you think will be the most prominent in 2023? And maybe even touch on, because we do have a lot of Northern California, we have pretty big constituency from Northern California tuned in. Maybe for that region of the market, what do you think is a particular item that we should be particularly looking out for?
Yeah, I mean, obviously, I talked about the repricing of real estate and the fact that transactions are going to be slow for a little while until we get more price discovery, and really until people who are sitting on assets at the moment come to terms with what those new valuations are likely to look like, and are either forced or choose to recycle them back to the market to replace their capital with someone else who's maybe better placed to take the buildings forward. But I think all of the trends will play in some way or another. The one I think that is probably most likely is number two, operational excellence. Just the fact that we saw with retail that the days of owning a shopping center and letting the retailers get on with trying to do their business decades ago, it was recognized that it's now much more of a partnership. And I think, the pandemic and flexible working is creating the office sector's online retail moment, that building owners are going to have to partner and think much more carefully, even in the mainstream office sector, around what type of experience their building and the area around their building and the amenities in the building are providing. Not for the CFO who pays the rent, but for the ultimate customer, which is the people who are deciding whether or not to come into the building to sit in it and work every day, or whether they'd rather do it from home or a Starbucks. So I think that real focus on the operational side. And I think if you look at the kind of environment that we're in, that people are already looking well beyond those mainstream retail, office, apartment, industrial sectors, and looking at other sectors where real estate is more closely aligned with the underlying operational business, whether that's, healthcare or other segments of the residential market. Data centers, all sorts of other places where understanding the dynamics of the occupier side is really important. So that combination of data and analytics playing out with thinking about different aspects of the market to invest into, I think is going to be a real trend. If I were to add on, particularly given some of the challenges of some of the inner urban areas in San Francisco and other areas, I think also seeing how will private capital look to come in and not just leave those areas because they're no longer quite functioning the way they were, but actually look to partner with government in taking on some of the challenges, social and environmental challenges, in reinvigorating some of those parts of the cities that are maybe struggling at the moment.
Great, thanks. Here's a question for one of our viewers today, and Nick, you can answer this, and maybe Greg too. At what percent GDP do we have to worry about the U.S. debt? Seems there is a mix of opinions here, and we look to be approaching 130%.
Well, it's a huge issue. It's at some point there may be a day of reckoning. The good news, I think, is that there are other countries that are in line ahead of us. They're the cliched canaries in the coal mine. I mean, we'll see what happens to some other countries before the U.S. becomes the most critical one. But there's no panacea. I mean, there's no budget cutting option that really would make a big difference. People perhaps don't realize that discretionary government spending is like 16%. The real money is on entitlements like Social Security, and nobody dares to touch Social Security, and no one dares to touch taxes. So we can nibble around the edges, but I think any dramatic reduction of deficits is unlikely. The most we can hope for is that the rate of spending growth slows. We don't spend at quite the pace that we have for the last few years. That's the best you can hope for.
Yeah, I don't think there's a magic number. I mean, prior to the financial crisis, it always used to be sort of, 80-85% of GDP was seen as a bit of a warning signal. Japan has levels of debt that are immeasurably higher than that, but there are some specific factors there about the market for Japanese government debt. There's a big domestic market buying that debt. The challenge in the US, of course, is that US debt is globally one of the benchmark traded investment instruments, and therefore, if people, whatever the level of percentage is, if people get spooked about US government debt, that really is an all bets off type situation, I think. But certainly, 130% would be a worrying level. So I think the key is confidence, as Greg was talking, confidence that the US isn't going to default. I think it's more that confidence rather than necessarily the size of the absolute number.
You've hit the nail on the head. And I think that's why people like Janet Yellen are so worried about a possible default, because it could erode global confidence in the US Treasury market. That would be a horrible story.
Great. Turning to our panel that started the program today, there's a couple of questions here. First question is certainly not something we haven't had to address in the commercial real estate world in the past, and that is a question around abated rent. and concessions and what happens when these abated rent periods are over and a tenant defaults, tenant files bankruptcy. How are those funds recovered, or are they? Nick or Amber or Dina?
Yes, Jeff, I'll take that one. I think it's, obviously the landlord's responsibility to understand the credit profile of the tenant that they're doing business with. If that's a tech company, understanding their balance sheet, their funding, their business, and apply an appropriate letter of credit that would cover out-of-pocket costs. So there would be some recovery afterward. The same for professional corporations such as a law firm. You'd have to look at cash on hand, distributions, and understand how you could salvage any future issues with regards to solvency. Personal guarantees, letter of credits, those type of things. Security vehicles, enhanced security deposits. While cash is not perfect, it's still something that would secure the obligation. So that would be my answer there.
Great. Another question around downtown cores. And again, Amber, you work in that kind of market. Nick, you do. And the movement to work from home. There's been a lot of conversation on the difficulty that these urban markets have had, and certainly read about about repurposing of multi-tenant buildings. Nick Axford, you may have comment on this too, traveling the globe. Well, do you see any repurposing of multi-tenant office buildings happening in your urban markets? And do you think that we may see more of that in the next year or two as space potentially sits?
Nick Axford, do you want to take that?
Yeah, I mean, yes, we are seeing some. I mean, it's a clear potential opportunity. It's obviously repurposing from a sector that is struggling into one where there is still very deep demand. From a practical point of view, it's a lot harder than people think. It's a long process. It's a difficult process. Not every building is suitable. So I think, yes, we are seeing some in certain markets, certainly in North America. I mean, in parts of Europe where buildings tend to be a bit more multifunctional, you actually see some buildings flip-flopping between them, for example, in the West End of London. But in terms of big multi-tenant buildings, we are seeing some. I think we will see more, but it's not a panacea. Amber, have you got anything to add to that?
Yeah, I mean, just looking at downtown Oakland, we're not seeing that. We've seen folks looking to reposition to life science, but to your point, it's not as easy, as one would think, repurposing from office to life science. Obviously, there's a lack of supply within that in the Bay Area, but and everyone wants to get their hands in it. It's just not quite as easy as folks think, and very costly. So as of now, folks are just kind of waiting and being patient.
I would just add that the construction costs continues to be a deterrent in a lot of cases as well.
Exactly.
Okay, great. Thank you. Maybe turning back to Mr. Axford, when will we see Fed easing and 10-year government bonds come back down? And then another question is posed here, maybe you can wrap it into it. Are we in a recession, going into a recession? If so, how long, how deep?
Well, I mean, we saw the US did have at least what most of the rest of the world regards as a technical recession in last year, which it came out of again. Without getting into the semantics of of how you define one. Yes, I think it is quite possible that the US will still see a recession during the course of 2023, at least as defined as 2 consecutive quarters of negative economic growth. I think that there are clear signs that the US economy is slowing under the weight of interest rate rises. That said, the consumer has so far proved extremely resilient, and it is just possible that inflation will trend downwards at a rate that allows the Fed to not raise rates too high and potentially start easing, and that the consumer will continue to push the US economy through without going into recession territory. So I think the likelihood is that yes, we will, but I'm not. I don't foresee it being a particularly severe one, not a particularly sharp downturn.
And if I might add, I agree fully. If there is one, it will be mild. There's one factor that I think has not gotten enough attention, and that is all of the money we spent during and after COVID, several trillion. Not all of it's been spent yet. There are a lot of states that haven't spent the money. A lot of individuals haven't spent the money. California has, but of course that's California. But I would say that not all of this pandemic money has been spent, and that may keep the economy growing moderately for another couple of quarters. You know, by the end of this year, yeah, I agree with Nick. I mean, we could see some problem because of all the Fed tightening, but there's still an awful lot of money still out there.
Mm. There's a question in there as well, Jeff, around what that might mean for return to office. I'm not sure inflation's going to drive people. Will inflation and a recession drive people back to the office? I'm not sure about inflation, but I do think a weaker economy, coupled with the ongoing momentum of people being back in the office when everybody's sitting on Zoom or Teams, it works. When half the people are in the room and half the people are on Teams, it doesn't. And I think we're all starting to experience that. And as you get to the point where you're one of 6 people, then one of 4 people, then one of 3 people who isn't in the room of 10, I think, and people start going out for a drink after work and they're socializing in the office, that fear of missing out, coupled with not just wanting to be working, but be seen to be working, I think will drive, an ongoing drift. It's going to take time. It's going to be an ongoing drift back to the office, which is not to deny the points that Nick and I were making earlier about the fact that the shape of the office market is changing. You're going to have to offer better product. What was good enough is no longer good enough. But nevertheless, I do think that over time we will see a return to the office back towards the levels that we were seeing pre-pandemic, which, by the way, was never 100% occupancy, and it's not going to go back there because it was never there in the first place.
That's a great place to close. All of us would like to see more people back in the office. It makes for a more vibrant environment for all of us. And certainly in my experiences, we're seeing it more and more in our area. So that's all the time that we have. I really want to thank everybody for joining us today, for our speakers, for everyone who has tuned in. On behalf of Avis & Young, just want to let you know that within a couple of days, you'll all receive a follow-up email with links to recordings of the webinar, as well as how you can get your hands on additional information from today's presentations that might be relevant to you. Also, thank you to all the folks who participated in putting today's program together, and thank you all for joining us.
Thank you, Jeff, and our host.